So it's my pleasure to introduce today our speaker. Massimo Pigliucci is in the Department of Ecology and Evolution and also the Philosophy Department at Stony Brook University, as well as incoming chair of the Department of Philosophy at Lehman College. He is an outspoken critic of creationism. He's an advocate of science and of the teaching of evolution science education in general. His research is primarily on the evolution of genotype-environment interactions. He will tell you what that is. I'll try, maybe. He's published 96 technical papers, 4 books on evolutionary biology, and 2 books for the general public. He's won the Dobzhansky Prize from the Society for the Study of Evolution. He's been elected Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science for fundamental studies of genotype by environment interactions and for public defense of evolutionary biology from pseudoscientific attack. He writes regularly for one of the magazines published out of the Center for Inquiry, Skeptical Inquirer magazine, also for Philosophy Now, and maintains one of the most popular blogs out there on these topics, Rationally Speaking. He's debated the most prominent deniers of evolution in North America, young earth creationists, intelligent design proponents like Duane Gish, Kent Hovind, intelligent design proponents, William Dembski. That was at New York Academy of Sciences, I think. Also, Jonathan Wells. He's debated them on many occasions, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you for our lunchtime presentation, Massimo Pigliucci.
That's fine. Thank you. Thanks very much for the nice introduction. Now, I will not be talking about gene-environment interactions today. That might be another. Oh, I know. After lunch, talking about no. So speaking of which, since it is after lunch, and there's a good chance that people fall asleep at a lecture, especially a lecture that talks about a little bit about philosophy. Should you fall asleep, don't worry. The entire talk is available on my website, and you can download it. You won't miss a single slide. Nevertheless, I would prefer if you didn't fall asleep. And I'll try, of course, to minimize that chance. So what I'd like to talk to you today is something that we all talk about, but we don't necessarily think about that much, which is the very concept of reason. Now, books have been written on reason and rationalism and the relationship between reason and science. And I'm only going to talk for about 35 minutes or so, and hopefully leave some time for a discussion. But I just wanted to open up a discussion about the foundations of reason and how is it that we deploy it, and perhaps in some cases, how is it that we don't deploy it correctly. Being a group that is interested in promoting reason, it seems like talking about reason once in a while is a reasonable thing to do. So, without further ado, let's start with this quote from an anonymous philosopher who said that without logic, reason is useless. With it, you can win arguments and alienate multitudes, which has been, in fact, my experience since I started doing these sort of things. I am not the anonymous philosopher, by the way. Now, let's start with a little game. I'm going to give you 3 quotes in the next minute or so, and you try to figure out who said that. Each one of those is actually an example of a logical fallacy, but they're very popular. They're appeared in the popular media. Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you're with the terrorists. I gather from the laughter that you know who this guy is, right? All right, fine. That was too easy. Fine. No. Shocking. The second one might be a little more challenging. Why wouldn't anyone want to say the Pledge of Allegiance unless they detested their own country or were ignorant of its greatness? Close. Very close. Sean Hannity, exactly. Thank you. You don't win a prize, but that's very good. The last quote, although the particular inclination of the homosexual person is not a sin, it is a more or less strong tendency ordered to an intrinsic moral evil, and thus the inclination itself must be seen as an objective disorder. Close. Close, actually. I had never heard God talking about anything, so. Pope Ratzinger. Pope Ratzinger. So I would argue that these people do need a dose of reason. Of course, they're not the only ones. You know, we can all use reason. And one of the things I'm going to do in the rest of the talk is actually to talk a little bit about what I consider some of the myths about reason that are very widespread among the general public. Presumably not about this group, but you probably heard of most of these 7 myths of reason that they're going to take the first half of the talk. The second half of the talk, we're going to get a little bit more in depth into the relationship between reason and science, and then the relationship between reason, science, and what one might call wisdom, or what is a good way to make choices in life. Okay? So let's start with the 7 myths of reason, before which, of course, I have to give you a definition of reason, and then to contrast it with something else. So reason, of course, can be defined in a variety of ways, but these are pretty good approximations. A cause, explanation, or justification for any action or event. You know, you have a reason to do X. You know, there was a reason why I got up from my chair, I went to the refrigerator and got a beer because I was thirsty. Right? That's a reason. The power of the mind to think, understand, and form judgments by a process of logic, of course, is what we're talking about here in this context. This is opposed to, of course, faith, which is the complete trust or confidence in someone or something. Notice the accent on complete. Or a strong belief in God or in doctrines of a religion based on spiritual apprehension rather than proof. And that's the interesting term here. It's spiritual apprehension. What the heck is spiritual apprehension? How do people spiritually apprehend things? I can talk about how people logically or rationally think about certain things, but it is hard for me to get my mind wrapped around the idea of a spiritual apprehension. I suspect because there's no such a thing as a spiritual apprehension. It's an empty concept, and that's why it's difficult to wrap one's mind around it. All right, that said, the stage is set for the 7 myths of reason as I've encountered them in the now 12 or 13 years that I've been active in this movement. Number 1, reason is limited. Therefore, well, therefore what? First of all, of course, no philosopher that I know, no scientist that I know, has ever claimed that reason is not limited. Okay? Reason is not a god. Human beings have what philosophers call epistemic limitations. Okay? There are certain things that we are pretty good at figuring out. There are other things that are pretty lousy at figuring out. And there's probably a large number of things that we simply cannot figure out. We don't have the brain power. We don't have the technological tools. We don't have the know-how. We sometimes don't have access to the information, to the pertinent information. So absolutely, reason is in fact limited. There's no question about it. The real question is, what are you going to do instead? Have you got anything better? To say the reason is limited is like saying that if your toolbox only has a hammer, you have a limited toolbox. Well, that's true. I can only hammer things. I suppose I can beat up somebody with a hammer. I can do a few other things with a hammer, right? But I can't fix a computer very likely with a hammer. Now, if you got a better tool, then by all means, provide me with your better tool and we'll fix the computer. But if you don't, then all I can do is keep using the hammer and concentrate on the things that I can do with a hammer. Now, this is an example of, when you'll see that, it's a logical fallacy. It is, in fact, a false dilemma. False dilemma is a situation where if option 1 fails, then automatically option 2 is true. Now, option 2 here, of course, is faith. Okay? Is that faith apprehension, the apprehension through faith that we're talking about. Well, reason is limited, therefore, you need faith. No, reason is limited, therefore, that's it. Reason is limited. That's all you get out of that. You don't win by default because you've shown that option 1 is not. So this is not viable. This is exactly the equivalent, the same kind of logical fallacy that Bush was committing a minute ago when he said you're against me or with me. Well, no, there could be a 3rd or 4th or 5th position about these sort of things. The second myth of reason that I hear very often is we need to go beyond reason. I can't count how many times I actually heard somebody tell me that we need to go beyond reason. Well, okay, where is this beyond? Because beyond implies that you actually have another place to go. It means that you actually can point somewhere else to go. And of course, that somewhere else typically, again, is a variation of either faith or intuition, although intuition is actually quite a different thing from, in fact, we'll talk about intuition in a minute, from faith. Well, my answer to that kind of myth is, well, what sort of non-reasoning activity has helped humanity doing things better? I've never seen non-reason-based medical cures, computers, important documents in human history like the US Constitution, absolutely important TV shows such as The Daily Show. I have seen very unimportant TV show done with very little reason, but that's, to me, it's not a good point in favor of the limitations of reason. The third myth is, well, there is too much emphasis on reason. Like, you know, people overplay it. You don't want to be too reasonable. Yeah, so my answer is, well, really? Since when? I mean, when was the last time that we checked our society and we said, yep, definitely too reasonable here. We need a little bit of craziness and irrationality. I mean, after all, it is not by chance that the US government, actually, the federal government has endorsed a National Day of Prayer, not a National Day of Reason. Right? But this talk was originally given in New York on the occasion of the National Day of Reason, which is not, unfortunately, a federal endorsed occasion, but something that CFI and other similar groups do. Now, I think this is a leftover from what is known as the romantic, not as in I fall in love with somebody, but as in the literary movement of Romanticism, the romantic reaction to the Enlightenment. So the idea was that, you know, writers and poets after the Enlightenment, after the French Revolution, got sick and tired of all these emphasis on reason and rationality and things of that sort, and therefore started what today is known, in fact, as the Romantic movement, which was a rejection of the very idea of reason. But first of all, it was a literary movement. I'm not so sure that they would apply it that much further outside of that particular area. Second of all, the historical record is actually quite doubtful. I don't think that even during the so-called Age of Reason, there was an overabundance of reason. I mean, after all, during the French Revolution, people's heads were chopped off for no particularly good reason and very, very easily. So I'm not sure that even during the Enlightenment, we actually did experience a true Age of Reason. We certainly did have a large number of influential intellectuals who did tout reason as the way to go to solve human problems. And in fact, as you probably know, as you surely know, the US Constitution is an indirect result of precisely that kind of movement. So we're still actually feeling the effects centuries later. But as far as, I mean, too much reason floating around, just turn on early afternoon TV, and you'll be quickly disillusioned of that notion. The fourth myth that I encounter often is that the idea that reason discards feelings and emotion. That is, that there is a counterposition, there is a trade-off between reason and emotion. So if you're too reasonable, you're sort of, then emotion goes down the drain, and you're not a balanced human being, and so on and so forth. Again, this is a logical fallacy. This assumes that there is, in fact, a trade-off, that it's a zero-sum game, that you either can be one way or the other. Now, the only person I know along those lines is Spock on Star Trek. And in fact, even he actually does a little more sophisticated things than just reason versus emotion. It is true, however, and we'll go to that in the second part of the talk, that there's been a long tradition of thinkers assuming that, in fact, there is a constant struggle inside ourselves between reason and emotion, and that somehow we're better off when one of the two is basically subjugated by the other one. But it doesn't have to be that way. In fact, modern neurobiology argues pretty convincingly that reason and emotions have to be balanced, otherwise you don't have a functional human being. Here's how a prominent neurobiologist, Antonio Damasio, put it in a book that it's actually very interesting about these sort of issues, the feeling of what happens. He says that emotions and the feelings are not a luxury. They are a means of communicating our states of mind to others, but they are also a way of guiding our own judgments and decisions. Emotions bring the body into the loop of reason. Notice, by the way, that he's making a distinction here between emotions and feelings. Most of us sort of think of the two as interchangeably, but there is, in fact, a distinction there, both scientifically and philosophically. In this particular case, feelings are the conscious and subjective experience of emotion. So you have emotions deep down, and then when you realize that you're emotional about something, that you feel something, that's the feeling. Hence the title of the book, by the way. The feeling of what happens is about how consciousness is about monitoring your internal states, of your internal mental states. But the idea, again, is that in fact, if you do not have a balance between the two, you're not going to be a particularly functional human being. And we have direct evidence from neurobiology. There are people who have severe brain damage in either the cortex, the frontal cortex, which is where most of the reason-based activity goes on in the brain, or in the amygdalas, which are the areas where most of the emotion-based activity in the brain goes on. And if your brain is seriously damaged in either one of those two, you really have a horrible life. And these are people either that cannot absolutely connect. If you have damage at the amygdalas, it means that you literally don't care about anything. You can understand things because your frontal cortex still functions. You can answer questions logically and rationally, but you don't give a damn about anything, including your own survival. And the reason for that is because you don't have an emotional reaction to things. Keep this particular point in mind because, as you will see in a minute, a very important philosopher made exactly that prediction 2.5 centuries ago. The other way around is also a pretty doubtful state of affairs. If you have your emotions intact, but you cannot, in fact, function logically, then you're bound to just follow whatever your emotions, your whims are, without actually thinking through. There's no long-term planning, essentially, of what you're doing, which also makes for a pretty miserable life. So no, you don't want, there is no opposition between the two. The two have to be integrated. The seventh myth is, the fifth myth is, but I bet you believe in evolution, don't you? I'm an evolutionary biologist, so almost the last resort when I discuss these things with people of faith, as they like to call themselves, is, well, but I'm sure you believe in something like evolution. I don't believe in evolution. I think evolution happens. I have a very strong conviction that evolution happens. That conviction is based on evidence, obviously. I don't have to tell you what that evidence is, but that's sort of part of the sort of evidence that we look at. Now, we can disagree on how much each particular piece of evidence is indicating one thing or another. There can be reasonable disagreements, for instance, about the mechanisms of evolutionary change. I don't think there can be any reasonable disagreement that evolution did happen. But it is not a belief in the sense of that I have faith in that sort of proposition. It simply seems to me overwhelmingly the logical conclusion to draw from the evidence. Pretty much in the same way, we'll get to that in a minute, where I'm also convinced of all sorts of other things for which I think there is evidence, and I'm much more skeptical about things for which there is much less evidence. Belief, by the way, in science as opposed to in faith matters, in science, and in particular in probability theory, belief is something that is supposed to be proportional to the evidence. In fact, there is even a mathematical formula known as Bayes' theorem, which tells you how strong your belief should be proportional to the evidence and how it should change with the evidence. Next to the last is, no matter what you say, you surely have faith in something. So if evolution doesn't work, then there is something else that you have faith in. Typically, again, my answer is no, I don't. The typical examples are, well, but sure you have faith in the fact that your mother or your spouse or pick your favorite relative loves you. Or you have faith that the universe is real. Well, let's talk about these two for a second. Let's talk about my mother. First of all, there's actually doubt. No. No. There is no doubt that she loves me. But how do I know? It's not a matter of faith, right? It's a matter of behavior. I mean, if I were, my mother lives in Italy. Suppose that every time I go there about once a year to visit. Suppose that as soon as I cross the threshold of the house, I get clubbed on the head. And this happens over and over and over, right? I think even a thick head like mine, after the third or the fourth instance, will start questioning that sort of belief that, well, maybe there's something wrong here. Maybe this person really doesn't like me. So no, in fact, our relationships with other people are based on evidence. You do not have faith about your life. You believe, sometimes strongly, that a person has feelings about you. But that belief comes directly out of your assessment of the behavior of that person. Sometimes, unfortunately, as we know, that belief turns out to be wrong. because you're basing that belief on what the person is saying more than what the person is actually doing. But that simply means that you're misreading the evidence. It doesn't mean that, that you should have faith somehow. Now, what about the fact that the universe is real? Technically speaking, of course, I don't know that. Right? I mean, there's a long tradition in philosophy called radical skepticism, which goes back 2,500 years and plus to the pre-Socratics, and which, unfortunately, to the chagrin of every philosopher who has ever lived, it is not refutable. You cannot refute the fundamental skeptics. The idea is that I cannot prove that you guys exist. You could all be a figment of my imagination. Okay? Now, first of all, the typical reaction that I get when I say something like this, well, sure, I can prove it to you. I can walk up, come to the stage, slap you in the face, and prove you that you're... No, don't do it. First of all, because it hurts. Second of all, because you get a reaction from me. Third, because you're missing the point. Because the feeling of pain itself could be, in fact, self-generated. Okay? It could be an illusion created by my own mind. There really is no way. In fact, it's really maddening. The more you think about it, there's just no way that I can prove that you guys exist. Of course, I could question my own imagination. You know, why would I want to be here today and having a number of people than others? But whatever. The thing is, I cannot prove it. What I can do, however, is to act according to the most reasonable interpretation of the evidence. Okay? I feel that there are people here, I see people here, I hear people, and so on. I talk to people. So the most logical and rational conclusion consistent with the facts as I see them is that you guys, in fact, do exist. Should it turn out that you don't, it doesn't really matter, because if I started really behaving as if you did not exist, I would probably end up in asylum for the insane. And that's not a pleasant way to spend the rest of your life, so I'm just going to go with that assumption until somebody proves it wrong. And as I said, nobody can actually prove it wrong. It's still not a matter of faith, however. It is not a matter of, well, I don't have any reasons to believe that. Of course I have reasons. Finally, well, if everything else fails, you know, at least keep an open mind. That I call the last refuge of the epistemological scoundrel. When you have to resort to, you know, well, keep an open mind, all right, fine, I'll keep an open mind. But of course, as one of my personal role models once said, Carl Sagan, it pays to keep an open mind, but not so open that your brains fall out. And the idea, of course, being that, yes, you do want to keep an open mind if by open mind you mean that you want to keep your beliefs just below, even your strongest beliefs, just below the level of absolute certainty. So that should enough overwhelming evidence come in, you are willing, in fact, to modify those beliefs according to the evidence. Now, I'm talking about, by the way, an ideal human being. I'm not suggesting that individual human beings would actually be able to, you know, human beings don't work like Bayesian calculators that automatically adjust their beliefs to the evidence. Most of us are stubborn and, you know, we refuse to do one thing or another regardless of how overwhelming the evidence is. But ideally, that's what I like. My ideal is something like this. It is a situation where I'm not actually absolutely 100% sure of anything, because if I were, then that would mean that I would put myself in a situation of being impervious to new evidence. And you don't want to do that. That would be close-minded. But of course, the problem, as Sagan was pointing out, is that what most people do is exactly the opposite. It's going way too much on the opposite side of the spectrum and essentially enter into the area of gullibility, where you're so open-minded that no matter how fanciful the notions that people put to you and no matter how flimsy the evidence is, you're going to believe it. Or at least you're going to say, yeah, there's a good chance. No, we can do better than that. All right. So those are the myths about reason that I encounter more often. Now let's talk about a little more in depth about how people have thought about reason, science, and the relationship between reason and emotions in particular. This all goes back to Plato, like most things in philosophy. Whitehead famously said that all philosophy is but a footnote to Plato. That may have been a slight exaggeration. But it is true that Plato did write about all sorts of things, and he did set out most of the problems that philosophers have been struggling with for 2,400 years. Now that's Plato with ink, because this wasn't done when he was alive, so I have no idea actually if he looked like that. One of the things that he did in The Republic, which is one of his most important books, is to come up with a tripartite theory of what at the time was called the soul, and today we would call the human mind. And Plato thought that the human mind has these three characteristics, these three components: reason, something kind of in between called spirit, and then desire. Desire is really basically what we will call today the emotional part, although it goes into the spirit as well, and then reason is what we'll still today refer to as reason. So reason is in charge of knowledge acquisition and thinking about knowledge. Spirit really deals with issues of honor and how people perceive us, and therefore our place in society, and how do we interact basically socially. And then desire has got to do with pleasures and basic desires, like being hungry, being thirsty, sexual desires, and so on and so forth. By the way, if those of you that are familiar with Freud's tripartite theory of the human mind, it's pretty close. There are differences, but the id, the ego, and the superego have some familiarity with these concepts. Now, the interesting thing about Plato is, nobody today anymore buys this kind of model, although that set out the discussion, as I said, for a long time. The interesting thing about Plato is that this is found in a book called The Republic. The Republic was about how to build a just society, a perfect society. It's a utopian book about a society. What the heck has that to do with society? Well, the idea was that Plato thought that society is simply a macrocosm. It's a larger version of the microcosm that is the human mind. And so that if we want to find out how to run society, how to build a good society, we need to find out how to build a good human being. So he started out with this analysis of what the human being is supposed to be, and then it actually said, well, if we translate that at the societal level, the thinkers are going to be in charge, philosophers. The soldiers are going to be keeping the social place, and then everybody else deals with the production of primary needs and primary means and so on and so forth. So the idea was, of course, that not surprisingly for a philosopher, philosophers really should be running the world. Okay? Now, this has never happened almost. Plato's student, Aristotle, got pretty close because he was the advisor of Alexander the Great. So that got pretty close to, and he influenced Alexander significantly. It actually happened for a very brief period of time during the Roman Empire when the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who was also a philosopher, was running things. And by all accounts, that was actually a pretty good time for the Roman Empire. But other than that, it's never happened. I doubt, seriously, that this is ever going to be happening again. And I doubt also that this would be a particularly good idea. But it does get us started with a discussion of, you see, where the opposition between reason and sort of more basic emotions start from. It goes all the way back in the Western tradition, 2,500 years. Now, if we leap to the 18th century, we find this other guy, David Hume, who basically shocked everybody and pretty much proposed the opposite, the exact opposite of the received wisdom, the exact opposite of Plato's view. Hume said that it's not reason that ought to be in charge of things, but quite the contrary, that emotions has to be in charge. In fact, famously, he put it this way: reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. Now, this is a pretty strange quote, especially from a philosopher who lived at the time of the Enlightenment, who was an empiricist, who was friend with Voltaire. So this is a guy who thought quite highly of reason. He's one of the fundamental skeptic philosophers. So what is he talking about here? I think he had a very good insight into the human condition. And he put actually the same concept in a variety of ways in different quotes. But essentially, he was getting at the fundamental point that unless you have an emotional involvement with something, whatever that is, your own survival, getting up in the morning, going to work, coming to a conference like this, unless you have an emotional involvement, emotional investment, a drive to do that, it wouldn't matter. Reason by itself is not going to give you enough of an incentive to act on anything. You have to have an emotional involvement. So in that sense, he was looking at reason as the instrument, as the means to the end, but the end is not determined by reason. The end is determined by what you care for. Why are you here instead of being partying? Well, you'll be partying later tonight, possibly. But why are you not doing that now? Why are you not outside? Why are you not working? Why are you not having, or being on a vacation? Because you care about these issues. You have an emotional attachment to certain things. You're pissed off by people like shenanigans, for instance, or you really can't stand the idea that that a lot of American kids learn about creationism, not about evolution, and so on and so forth. Those are things that really, when I hear shenanigans say something, my first reaction is I want to punch the guy on the nose. Then I'm going to, thank you. Then I'm going to stop and say, okay, what is it exactly that he's saying and where is he wrong? So that I can argue with him and with people like him. But my first reaction is I cringe in the morning whenever I listen to NPR, and I don't listen to Fox. Just NPR is sufficient. It sort of gets the adrenaline going, right? But the reason it gets the adrenaline going is not because there is any thought process, rational thought process that says, well, this is right, this is wrong, therefore I should really be doing this rather than that. It's a gut reaction. It is, in fact, an emotional reaction. Then I harvest that emotional energy with my rational processes, and I say, okay, well, then that's where I want to go, and that's what I want to do. That was pretty much Jung's idea. Now, we also have to talk about science and how we get reason to work in terms of giving us information about the world. Because we said in the beginning, early on, that one of the things that distinguishes us from the religious believer is that we think there are reasonable ways to access information about the world, to learn about the world, as opposed to sort of faith channels. Well, there are several ways to do that, and they're not necessarily mutually compatible. So let's talk about the two major ones for a minute, and then how they were brought together about a couple of centuries ago. So John Locke, who was an empiricist, thought that all human knowledge eventually comes down to the senses, to the use of the senses, to the empirical information that comes from the outside world. So this is the way he put it. All ideas come from sensation or reflection. Let us then suppose that the mind to be, as we say, white paper, the idea of a blank slate. Void of all characters, without any ideas, how comes it to be furnished? To these I answer in one word, from experience, in that all our knowledge is founded, and from that it ultimately derives itself. So for Locke and for other empiricists, knowledge comes from experience, and that's the ultimate foundation of knowledge. Except that when you think about it for more than a few minutes, you realize that that can't be the whole story. Okay? And in fact, there's another philosophical tradition, which is called rationalism, which was epitomized most importantly by René Descartes, the guy that said, I think, therefore I am, and not I drink, therefore I am, as it's often referred to. He said, no, wait a minute, there's a problem here. The senses deceive from time to time, and it is prudent never to trust wholly those who have deceived us even once. Now, he was talking about, it's a good point. He was talking about things like hallucinations or dreams. Sometimes you have vivid dreams that are so real, so realistic, that you wake up, sweat and all. Usually they're not pleasant dreams, unfortunately. I don't understand why. Why couldn't be pleasant dreams be realistic? But anyway, typically they tend to be pretty unpleasant experiences. Hallucinations, which you can, of course, they can happen naturally, or you can induce by ingesting certain substances, as you know, or maybe you don't. Those things are clear examples. Mirages are other examples of the senses being obviously deceived by the external world or by the internal workings of the mind. So Descartes said, that's not a good way to go. So what do? Well, true operations of our understanding, intuition and deduction, on which alone we have said we must rely in the acquisition of knowledge, he said. So let's forget about intuition for a second. Deduction. Deduction is the holy grail of rational, logical thinking. Deduction is what mathematics is based on. Deduction is what logic is based on. When you prove a mathematical theorem or when you prove a logical proposition, you're using deduction. If well used, That is, if you don't make a mistake, an actual technical mistake in deploying a deductive reasoning, it is an absolutely foolproof of whatever it is that you want to demonstrate. Okay. Once you demonstrate a mathematical theorem, again, unless you made a mistake, that's it. There is no discussion. It's not that there is more information that can come out later on and say, no, you were actually wrong. The internal sum of the triangles, of the angles of a triangle is not 180 degrees. Yes, it is. If certain assumptions are in place, that's it. That's the result. So deductive logic has always been particularly high in the esteem of both philosophers and scientists because they realized that philosophers have worked with deductive logic for a long time. The reason scientists like deductive logic is because scientists like math, the power of mathematics. And they realize that that comes from deductive logic. Unfortunately, as June pointed out, in fact, science doesn't work that way. Science doesn't work on deductive logic alone because at some point or another, you have to go and examine the premises. I said a second ago that the internal sum of the angles of a triangle is 180 degrees, right? But of course, most of you probably thought, well, if you're using Euclidean geometry, because if you're not in Euclidean geometry, then that's not true. In other words, if your assumptions are correct. So you have to go and check the assumptions. The problem in science is that checking assumptions, the only way to check the assumptions is by actually making observations about the real world. And observations are fallible. We go back to the first problem that Descartes has. So now you're in a situation where you have a really powerful way of reasoning, deduction, which however is not sufficient to gather knowledge. You have a way of reasoning, which the one that Hume was talking about, and Locke were talking about, which comes from evidence that seems to give us a lot of information about the external world, but it's not reliable. So what do? Now you're stuck with sort of two tools that neither one of which is sufficient to give you knowledge. Well, the guy that solved brilliantly the problem was a philosopher that came right after Descartes and Kant. And then people say that philosophy doesn't make progress. Immanuel Kant, who basically synthesized empiricism and rationalism. He put them together and he said, look, the best you can do is in fact the combination of these two things. And here's how the combination works. Here's a famous quote from Kant. He said, experience without theory is blind, but theory without experience is mere intellectual play. Theory here is the deductive part of science. Experience, of course, is the inductive part of science. It's how you get information from the natural world. Well, how do you put them together? The brilliant insight that Kant has was that there was something other than just deduction and experience that you could use. You start with experience about a particular topic, if I'm curious about a particular scientific issue, for instance, I certainly need data, because if I don't get data, I don't get experience, if I don't get information about it, I'm not going anywhere. But that experience is actually filtered through a couple of things, one of which are what Kant called a priori intuitions, like a concept of space and time. We don't learn about space and time. We come equipped as human beings with a way to understand space and time. We don't have to be told about it. We don't have to learn about it in school. And we don't have to learn it from experience. It's neither a deductive nor an inductive thing. It's just there's something about being a human animal that equips us with these a priori intuitions about how the world works, how the world is organized. Not only that, there are some things that we know about the world. Kant called them categories. We would call them attributes of things, like causality, existence itself, the fact that things are limited, that they're not unlimited, the fact that there's more than one thing, one version of the same thing, and so on and so forth. All of these concepts come into our understanding of things. In fact, the last part there is understanding. But they're not the result of either experience or deductive reasoning. They just are a way in which our brain comes equipped. Now, Kant wrote right before Darwin, so he had no concept of evolution. Had he written after Darwin, he probably would have put these things in an evolutionary perspective. The reason we're able to learn about the natural world in a way that is fairly reliable is because evolution has favored animals that can gather reliable information about the natural world, because that information makes a difference in terms of the only two things that matter in life, survival and reproduction, at least from the point of view of natural selection. Okay? We have a few other things that we value, but the fundamental two are survival and reproduction, right? So we're talking about the consequence of this, the ultimate outcome of this is what today philosophers call evolutionary epistemology. There is a whole theory, which I have no time to get into, and it will take a whole different talk, but it's fascinating, that essentially says that the best account that we have of human knowledge is a combination of the classical accounts, empiricism, rationalism, and so on, plus this idea that in fact we are we've been built over time by natural selection to gather reliable information about the world. There is a downside to that, however. That also explains what I referred to earlier at the beginning of the talk as epistemic limitations that human beings have. We're pretty good at figuring out things about the world at the scale that is important to our survival and reproduction. We're increasingly lousy at figuring out how the world works at scales that are much larger or much smaller. That's why you need a PhD in physics if you're interested in cosmology. That's why you need a PhD in physics if you're interested in quantum mechanics. Because at those levels, our intuitions break down completely. We don't have a priori reliable intuitions about the quantum mechanical world because they don't make a single difference to your survival or reproduction. It doesn't matter if you understand quantum mechanics or not. Okay? Which is why our intuitions break down, which is why we need a more sophisticated approach that we call modern science. All right, so what are we? Well, I would say, therefore, that when you put everything, the whole thing together, the question of how do we get reasonable judgment, or what some people refer to as wisdom. So how do we get to conclusions that are going to be useful for us to live a good life, to live a balanced life, to set priorities in life that make sense? Not through faith. The only thing you're not going to see appearing over here, it's faith. But in fact, through a combination of things. One, of course, is reason, which itself is the result of a combination of essentially logic and evidence. Right? That's the classic pathway that sort of an Enlightenment philosopher would put forward. But you also need your emotions. As I said, neurobiology shows you that unless you have a functional emotional component to your brain, you're more certainly not going to be wise. You're going to have living a really miserable life. So you need a balance between these two. You also need a certain amount of intuition, and I use the word loosely here, in some sense, in the sense of Kant. There's intuitions about the world, about how things work. Neurobiologists today think of intuition as a subconscious parallel processing of information by the brain. When you have intuitions about certain things, people that can actually study intuition today, cognitive scientists study intuition. And having intuition about something simply means that your brain keeps collecting information all the time, whether you're paying attention or not, and keeps processing that information all the time. And it integrates that information in a complex way that deals both with the emotions and the reason, as well as this subparallel processing. This is a pretty complicated picture, but it's a much more satisfying picture than, say, that I acquire things by a faith instinct or somehow some kind of extra sensorial channel that tells me exactly what is right and what is wrong. Unfortunately, of course, that sort of wisdom that you arrive at is provisional, fallible. That's just a human condition. Get used to it. Let me close with a quote from a friend of mine, Austin Daisy, who's been very important for CFI. He said, "Guts are important. Your guts are what digest things. But it is your brains that tell you which things to swallow and which not to swallow." That seems to me like a pretty graphic balance between your intuitions and your reason. Thanks very much for your attention.